I had been the best shot in our section for 3 years, and I want to say that plainly at the start, because everything that came after only means something if you understand how much I had riding on it. We were dug into the mill district on the west bank of the Vel, in a city called Kadresh that had been beautiful once, and was now a geometry of broken concrete and standing water. The river split the city the way a wound splits a hand. We held the west, the enemy held the east and most of the north, and between us ran a dead zone of collapsed apartment blocks, a rail yard turned to slag, and the long gray ribbon of the northern road, which our map still called by its old peacetime name, and which everyone in the section now called the Gauntlet, because nothing crossed it in daylight and lived. I ran the shooting for our platoon, 6 men who could put a round where it needed to go, and me above them, and that pecking order was as real to us as rank. We had earned it in worse cities than this one. So when the sergeant major told me a new marksman was coming up from the replacement depot to fill the slot we'd lost when Petrakis took shrapnel through the shoulder, I did what any man protective of his house does. I decided in advance that the replacement would be a disappointment, and I looked forward to being proven right. Her name was Corporal Dana Voss. She came up the line on a resupply truck in the gray hour before dawn, sitting on an ammunition crate with her ruck between her boots and her hands folded on top of it, still, the way a person's hands are still when they have learned that stillness costs nothing and buys a great deal. She was not big. She was not loud. She stepped down off the tailgate, took in the mill and the sandbagged windows and the men watching her from the shadows, and said nothing at all. She just looked slowly, the way you'd read a page. "That's her," said Rook at my shoulder. Rook was my number 2, a good shot and a worse mouth. "That's our Phil." "That's our Phil," I said. I had already decided. I want to be honest about that because it is the part I am least proud of. I had decided before she said a word. The section had a tradition, though tradition is a generous word for it. When a new shooter came in, we didn't hand them a good rifle. Good rifles were earned. We handed them whatever the armory had that nobody wanted, and we watched how they carried it, and how they carried it told us who they were before they ever lay down behind glass. It was cruel in the small, deniable way that hard men are cruel to each other, and mostly it was harmless, because mostly the rifle got swapped out within a week, once the new man proved he wasn't a fool. The rifle we had for Voss was not merely unwanted. It was a joke that had outlived the men who'd started telling it. It was a bolt gun we called the Widow, and it had been the Widow long before I arrived, a long-action rifle that had been caught in the open when a mortar walked across our old position 2 deployments back, and had come out of it with a hairline in the receiver, a stock cracked and epoxied and cracked again, and an optic that had been rebuilt twice and still, everyone swore, would not hold a zero past 400 meters. It shot loose. It shot left. It shot, the men said, like a rifle that wanted to miss. 3 shooters had tried to make peace with it over the years, and all 3 had given it back and asked for anything else. It lived on a rack by itself with a strip of tape on the stock that said, in Petrakis' handwriting, "Do not trust." We gave her the Widow. I carried it out to her myself in front of the section, because I wanted them to see me do it, and I wanted her to understand the message without my having to say it out loud. The message was, "You are filler. You are the round we put in the chamber when we don't care whether it fires. Do not get comfortable. Do not imagine you have a place here that you have not earned." She took the rifle from my hands. She turned it over once slowly, and her thumb found the taped crack in the stock, and then the seam at the receiver, and then she looked down the length of it toward the rebuilt optic, and I watched her face the whole time, waiting for the flinch, the swallowed insult, the thing I could file away as weakness. It didn't come. She looked up at me and said, "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," in a voice with nothing in it, no sarcasm I could catch and punish, no anger I could stand on. Just the 2 words, flat and clean, and then she carried the Widow to a corner of the mill floor, sat down against the wall with it across her knees, and began in the gray light to take it apart. Rook laughed. A couple of the others laughed. Somebody said, loud enough to carry, "Careful with the antique, sweetheart, it's older than you and twice as broke." And there was a ripple of it, the easy laughter of men who are sure of their own standing, and Voss did not look up. She laid the bolt on a clean cloth. She laid the magazine beside it. She ran a finger along the crack in the receiver, feeling it, learning it, the way you'd learn the grain of a thing you were going to have to live with, and she did not laugh, and she did not scowl, and she did not perform being fine. She simply went on taking the rifle apart, as if the men were weather, as if the insult were weather, as if all of it were a kind of wind she'd long ago learned to shoot in spite of. I told myself that meant nothing. I told myself the quiet ones were the ones who broke worst when the pressure came, and that a woman who wouldn't rise to Rook's mouth would fold when the city started killing us in earnest. I told myself a great many things, standing there in the dawn with my authority intact and my judgment already made, and every one of them was wrong, and it would take me 11 days and one impossible shot to learn how wrong. That was the first morning. Let me tell you about the days between. For the first 3 of them, she did nothing that changed anyone's mind, which is to say, she did exactly what a serious shooter does, and none of it looked like anything to men who had decided not to see it. She cleaned the widow. Not the quick pull-through a man does to keep his sergeant happy, but a slow, total cleaning, the kind you give a rifle you intend to trust with your life or someone else's. Every surface, every spring, the bore scrubbed and mirrored and scrubbed again, the optics mounts checked with a torque driver she'd brought in her own kit, snugged to spec and marked with a paint pen so she'd see at a glance if anything walked loose. She replaced the epoxy on the stock crack with something her ruck that set harder and cleaner than the mess Petrakis had left. She did not ask permission, and she did not ask for a better rifle. She treated the widow like the only rifle in the world, and I mistook that for a lack of ambition instead of what it was, which was the opposite. On the second day she went out to the sandbagged firing slot we used for confirming 0, a covered position looking east over the rail yard, where you could touch off a round into the dead ground without giving your whole position away, and she shot the widow at 100 meters, and then at 200, and then at 3, and she wrote everything down. I watched her from the doorway, arms folded, ready to enjoy it. Everyone knew the widow shot left. Everyone knew it wouldn't hold past 4. She'd waste an afternoon and a fistful of match rounds proving to herself what the tape on the stock already said, and then she'd come to me and ask for a real rifle, and I would tell her that real rifles were earned, and the whole thing would resolve into the shape I'd already built for it in my head. She did not come to me. She shot and she wrote and she shot and she wrote, and where I saw a rifle wandering off its point of aim she saw, I understand this now, a rifle wandering off its point of aim the same way every time. Because that is the thing about a fault, the thing I was too proud and too settled to grasp. A rifle that shoots left randomly is junk, but a rifle that shoots left consistently is not junk at all. It is a rifle with a number. It is a rifle you can learn. The men who'd handed the widow back over the years had all made the same mistake, which was to ask whether they could trust it and, finding they couldn't, walk away. Voss asked a different question. She asked how exactly it lied. And a lie you can measure to the 10th of a mil is not a lie anymore. It is just another correction, no different from wind, no different from the drop of the round or the spin of the earth. It is data. By the end of the second day, she had the widow's fault written down to a number and a distance curve, a left drift that grew with range in a way she could predict and dial out, and she had shot a group at 500 meters. Off a rifle the whole section swore couldn't hold past 4, that I would not have been ashamed to shoot off my own gun. I didn't see the group. She didn't show it to anyone. I only learned about it later, from the range log she kept in a small waterproof notebook in a chest pocket, in a hand so neat it looked printed. If I had walked over and asked to see that notebook on the second day, this would be a different story, and I would be a smaller part of it. But I didn't. I stood in the doorway and watched a corporal waste ammunition on a broken rifle, and I felt the warm, stupid comfort of a man whose worldview is holding, and I went back inside. The thing that changed the city changed on the fourth day, and it had nothing to do with Voss, or so I thought at the time. Intelligence came up the line, the careful, second-hand way it always came, 3 days stale and half of it wrong, that the enemy on the East Bank had a new hand on the tiller. Their push into the mill district had been sloppy for weeks, costly, badly timed, the kind of fighting that gets men killed for ground that doesn't matter. Then it wasn't sloppy anymore. The probes came at the seams of our line instead of the strong points. The mortars started falling where we massed instead of where we'd been an hour before. Somebody over there had begun to think, and thinking on the other side of a river is the most dangerous thing there is, because you cannot shoot a thought. The name that came up the line was a general, a field commander they'd pulled from a quieter front and set loose on Kadresh with orders to take the West Bank before the winter closed the roads. Our people called him by a code word I won't bother repeating. The men on the East Bank, we learned later, called him something that translated roughly to the clockmaker, because he made the pieces move on time. He was careful. He was methodical. He did not expose himself. He ran his war from a command post somewhere back in the northern industrial belt, well beyond the river, well beyond anything we could reach. And under his hand the pressure on our line went from a thing we were winning to a thing we were slowly, methodically losing. The captain wanted him dead. Of course he did. Every man on our side of the Vel wanted him dead. But wanting is cheap, and the general knew his trade, and for a week he was nothing to us but a shadow behind the enemy's competence, a man who never showed himself where a rifle could reach. Then our scouts found the seam, not in his defenses, in his routine. The general had a forward post he liked to visit, an observation position in the shell of a grain elevator up the northern road, on the enemy's side of the dead zone, from which on a clear morning you could see the whole sweep of the mill district and the river beyond. He went there, the scouts said, every second or third dawn, to see the ground his maps described with his own eyes, because he was that kind of commander, the kind who trusts the terrain more than the report. He came in a vehicle, under cover of the last dark, with a small security detail, and he stood in the elevator's high loading bay for 20 minutes in the gray light and looked at us, and then he left. And the loading bay of that grain elevator, the scouts said, giving me the range card with something close to an apology in their eyes, was 3,200 meters from the nearest position on our bank that could see it. 2 miles. I want to be clear about what 2 miles means to a man who shoots for a living, because it is the whole hinge of this story. It is not a hard shot. It is not even really a shot at all in the sense that the word usually carries. It is a problem. It is a mathematics problem the size of a building, and the round spends the better part of 6 seconds in the air getting to the answer. And in those 6 seconds, the wind that is doing one thing at your muzzle is doing 3 other things over the river and a 4th thing in the cold column rising off the water, and the earth itself turns under the bullet, and the round falls the height of a cathedral and has to be thrown that high to come down on the mark. And the target is a man-shaped thing you can barely resolve in the best glass you own. At 2 miles, the best shooters in the world miss far more than they hit, and they do it from stable platforms, in known conditions, with rifles built and tuned for exactly that and nothing else. I had made shots past a mile, 2 of them in my life, both of them the proudest work I'd ever done, both of them off my own rifle, a good rifle, a trusted rifle, a rifle I knew like my own pulse. I looked at the range card the scouts brought back, and the honest thing rose up in me before the proud thing could stop it, and the honest thing said, I can't make that shot. Not with my rifle, not on my best day. 2 miles was past the edge of what I could promise, and I had spent 3 years being the man who did not promise what he could not deliver, because in our trade the difference between those 2 things is a dead friend. The captain called the section together that evening in the mill, and he laid the range card on an ammunition crate under a shielded lamp, and he asked the question I already knew the answer to. Can anyone here make this? The men leaned in and looked at the numbers, and one by one the honest ones leaned back. Rook shook his head. Rook, who would tell you he could shoot the wings off a fly at any range you named, went quiet and said, "Not at 2 miles, sir. Not on a man, I'd be lying." And that was the truest thing I ever heard come out of Rook's mouth, and it cost him something to say it, and I respected him for it. The captain looked at me last, because I was the best they had, and everyone in that circle knew it, and I felt the weight of 3 years of being the best settle onto my shoulders like a wet coat. Halloran. And I told the truth, which was the hardest professional thing I have ever done. "I can get close, sir," I said. "On the right morning with the right wind off a solid rest, I can put rounds into that loading bay. But close isn't a kill at 2 miles. To drop a man at that range, first round, cold bore, before he ducks back inside, sir, I can't promise that. Anyone who promises you that is selling you something." It was the right answer. It was the honest answer. And the captain nodded, because he was a serious man who'd rather hear a hard truth than a comfortable lie, and the lamp hissed, and the meeting was breaking up into the low, disappointed murmur of men who have been handed a problem they can't solve. When a voice from the edge of the light, flat and clean, with nothing in it, said, "I can make that shot." Everyone turned. Voss was sitting against the wall where she always sat, the widow across her knees, the little waterproof notebook open in her hand. She hadn't stood up. She hadn't raised her voice. She'd said it the way another person might mention that it looked like rain, an observation, offered because it was true and might be useful, and for no other reason at all. For a moment nobody said anything, and then Rook laughed, and it was an ugly sound and it broke the spell. "You," he said, "with the widow, you're going to make a 2-mile shot the staff sergeant just told us he can't make, off the broken gun." He looked around the circle for the rest of the laugh and got some of it, the nervous kind. "Sit down, sweetheart. Grown-ups are talking." I should have stopped him. I was his sergeant and it was my job, and I didn't, because a part of me, the small, proud, frightened part that had just admitted in front of my captain and my men that there was a shot I couldn't make, that part wanted her slapped down. Wanted the impossible thing she'd said to be as ridiculous as Rook was making it, so that my own failure would look like the ceiling of what was possible instead of merely the ceiling of what I could do. The captain, though, was not a proud man in that way. The captain was a man drowning slowly in a general he couldn't reach, and he had just watched his best shooter tell him no, and here was a corporal in the corner telling him yes, and he had the wisdom, or the desperation, they can look alike, to ask the next question instead of laughing. "Corporal," he said, "you understand the range on that card." 3,200 meters, sir," she said. "Give or take. I want to range it myself off the hide, but I trust the scouts to 100 meters and I can true it from there." She said the numbers the way you'd say your own address. "And you're telling me you can make it, that shot, on this man?" "I'm telling you," Voss said, "that I can build that shot. It's not one I take cold. I'll need the position for 3 or 4 days before he comes. I need to learn the wind on that line at that hour. I need to range every feature between the hide and the elevator so I can read the mirage off known distances, and I need to shoot the rifle enough at extension to trust my dope in these conditions. Give me the days and a clear morning and I'll put the first round where it needs to go." She paused, and then she added the only thing she said that whole meeting that wasn't pure arithmetic. "I've made this shot before, sir, farther than this. It's not a miracle. It's just work most people won't do." The mill was very quiet. "Off the widow," Rook said again, but the laugh was gone from it now, and it came out almost plaintive. A man watching the ground he was standing on turned to water. Voss looked at him then, and it was the first time I'd seen her really look at any of us, and there was no anger in her face and no triumph, just a kind of patient, level clarity, like the surface of deep water on a still day. "The rifle shoots 2.3 mils left at 1,000 and it grows on a curve I've got written down," she said. "It's not broken. It's just honest about being off, which is more than most rifles are. I know exactly what it does at every range I'll ask of it. That's worth more than a rifle you think is perfect and haven't measured." She looked back at the captain. "I'll take the widow, sir. I trust it more than a gun I haven't learned." I had spent 4 days believing I was watching a woman fail to complain about a broken rifle. I understood in that moment that I had been watching a woman master one, and that the mastery had been happening in plain sight the entire time, in a corner, in a notebook, while I stood in a doorway and felt my worldview hold. The captain straightened up. He looked at the range card and he looked at Voss, and he looked for a long moment at me, asking me, without asking, whether he should trust her. And here is the thing I have to live with. The proud part of me wanted to say no. Wanted to say, "She's untested, sir, she's filler. Don't hang this on the new corporal and the broken gun." But under the proud part, older than it, there was the part of me that had actually spent my life learning to shoot. And that part had heard her say 2.3 mils left at 1,000 and it grows on a curve, and had felt the hair stand up on my arms, because that is not how a fraud talks. That is not how a fool talks. That is how the best shooter you have ever met talks, and I had met a few, and none of them had ever unsettled me the way this quiet corporal in the corner just had. "She's got the technical picture, sir," I heard myself say. "Better than I gave her credit for. If anyone can build that shot," and the words cost me every ounce of the 3 years I'd spent at the top of my little mountain, "it's a shooter who talks like that." The captain nodded slowly. "Then build it, corporal," he said. "You've got your days, tell me what you need." Voss closed her notebook and stood, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that truck she looked, for just a second, like the work ahead of her was something she was glad to have. "I need a hide with a clean line to the elevator," she said. "A spotter who'll do exactly what I say and nothing I don't, and every match round you can spare." Then she looked at me, not at Rook, not at the captain, at me, the man who'd carried her the broken rifle to insult her, and she said the thing that turned me all the way around. "I'd like the staff sergeant on the glass, sir. He was honest about the shot he couldn't make. That's the man I want reading wind for the one I can. I did not want a spot for her. I want that on the record too, alongside everything else I'm not proud of. When she asked for me by name, my first feeling was not honor. It was exposure. Because a spotter is not a passenger. A spotter reads the wind and calls the correction and shares the shot. And if the shot is a miracle, then the spotter helped build the miracle. And if the shot is a failure, then the spotter stood at the edge of the failure and watched it happen up close. She had just, in front of my captain and my men, made me part of whatever this became. She'd taken the man who'd insulted her and lashed him to her mast, and she'd done it so gracefully. He was honest about the shot he couldn't make, that saying no would have looked like cowardice. So I said yes, and I told myself I was doing it to keep an eye on her, and that lie lasted about as long as it took us to reach the hide. We went out in the dark of the 5th morning, the two of us and a security element, low and slow through the ruined mill district, to a position the scouts had marked, the top floor of a gutted grain store on our own bank, a corner room with half its outer wall gone and the rest of it standing just enough to keep us in shadow. From the ragged edge of that wall, the northern road ran away to the northeast, over the dead zone, over a bend of the gray river, and there, at the vanishing end of it, small and pale in the last starlight, stood the shell of the enemy's grain elevator with its high black rectangle of a loading bay. 2 miles of air. Voss set up without a word wasted. She built her position the way a mason builds a wall, a bag under the fore end, a bag under the toe of the stock, the rifle floating between them so that when she was behind it she had to add almost nothing, hold almost nothing, fight almost nothing. She got behind the widow and settled, and I watched her disappear into it, her breathing going long and slow, her whole body organizing itself around the glass. And I understood that I was watching a level of craft I had told myself for 3 years that I owned, and did not. Then she started to work, and the work was the thing that finished off the man I'd been. She didn't shoot. Not that first morning, nor the second. She measured. She ranged every feature between us and the elevator: a burned truck at 800, a fallen bridge span at 1400, a lone standing chimney at 22, the near lip of the elevator's own foundation, and she wrote each one down and then she used them. Because you cannot see wind. But you can see what wind does, the shimmer of mirage boiling off the ground, the way it leans and runs. And if you know the exact distance to the thing you're reading the mirage against, you can turn that lean into a number. She read the mirage off the burned truck and called it a value at 800. She read it off the chimney and called it a different value at 22, because the wind over the river was not the wind at our muzzle. And she knew that, and she was mapping it in layers, the whole 2-mile column of moving air broken into segments she could account for one at a time. "The river's the problem," she said quietly, on the second morning, her eye never leaving the glass. "Cold air coming off the water, rising, pushing the round up and pushing it right in that middle third. Watch the mirage over the span, see how it stands up straighter there than at the truck. That's the column. If I read the whole flight as one wind I miss by 20 feet, it has to be read in thirds." I looked where she told me to look, through my own spotting scope, and I saw it. I had been shooting for 12 years and reading wind for 10, and she showed me a thing in the air over that river that I had never once seen, because I had never once thought to break the shot into thirds and read each third against a known distance. She wasn't better than me by a margin. She was better than me the way a cartographer is better than a man with a good sense of direction. On the third morning she shot. Not at the elevator. You don't announce yourself to the target you're building for. She shot at the fallen bridge span at 1400, into a shadowed pocket of it where the strike wouldn't be seen from the far bank. And she shot the widow, the broken gun, the joke. And she put 3 rounds into a space you could have covered with a dinner plate at 1400 meters, in a crosswind off a bag, cold. Then she dialed her curve, her 2.3 mils and growing, her honest fault, and shot again at 2200 against the base of the standing chimney, and did the same thing. And then she read me the correction she'd need to carry that group the rest of the way to 2 miles. And I checked her math against my own dope card out of sheer stubborn habit. And her math was right and my card was conservative. And I put my card away and did not take it out again. That was the morning I stopped guarding my little mountain. Somewhere between the bridge span and the chimney I stopped being the best shot in the section watching a rival and started being what she'd actually asked me to be, which was a good pair of eyes serving a great shooter. It was the most useful I had been in a year, and I hadn't fired a round. We talked in the long gray waits, not much and never about herself. She asked me about the local wind, the river's moods, the way the light came up over the eastern rooftops, practical things, things I knew from months in that city that she'd fold into her picture. I asked her once on the third afternoon where she'd learned to break wind into thirds like that, and she was quiet for a while and then she said, "Somewhere colder than here, a longer valley." And that was all, and I didn't push, because a shooter's past is her own, and I'd insulted her enough for one lifetime without prying into it. I did not know her call sign. I did not know the record. I knew only what she'd shown me on that broken rifle over 3 cold mornings, and it was already enough to have unmade 3 years of my certainty and rebuilt it, quietly, into something better. The knowledge that the top of a mountain is a small place, and there is always more sky above it than you think. On the evening of the third day, the scouts sent word up the line. The general had visited his elevator that dawn, right on his pattern, which meant the next visit would be the 6th morning or the 7th, which meant we had one more night, and then we waited in the hide for a man who came with the light, and either she made the shot the whole line couldn't, or she didn't. And I found, and this surprised me more than anything, that I wanted her to make it not so she'd be proven and rook-shamed, but simply because I had spent 3 days beside the finest shooter I'd ever met, and I wanted the world to be the kind of place where that got to matter. The 6th morning he didn't come, and the not coming was its own kind of war. We were in the hide before 3 in the black cold, and we lay through the whole slow graying of the sky with the elevator's loading bay resolving out of the dark, and the wind came up off the river the way she'd said it would, and she read it in thirds and dialed and waited, and the loading bay stayed empty. The light came full. The mirage began to boil. A vehicle moved once on the far road and our hearts stopped, and it was a supply truck, not him, and it passed. By mid-morning the thermals were too strong to trust, and she called it quietly, without frustration. Not today. He's late in his cycle or he skipped. We come back tomorrow. And we broke the position down and slipped back through the ruins, and I lay awake most of that day with my nerves singing. And she, I have no doubt, slept like a stone, because she had learned somewhere colder than here that the weight costs nothing if you don't let it. The 7th morning he came. I saw the vehicle first, far out on the northern road, a low dark shape running without lights in the last of the dark, and I put my scope on it and my mouth went dry. Movement, I said, and I heard her breathing change, the long, slow rhythm of a shooter settling the final inch into the rifle. The vehicle stopped at the base of the elevator. Small figures got out, the security detail spreading, and then one figure who did not spread, who walked with the unhurried certainty of a man who owns the ground he stands on, into the black doorway at the base of the shell and out of our sight. He's inside, I said. He'll come up to the bay. Then we wait for the bay, she said. And we waited, and the light came up and the mirage began to move, and she read it, full value left in the near third, dropping to half over the water, picking up right in the far third off that eastern wall, call it a net 4¼ left, holding. And I read my own glass against hers, and I said, confirm 4¼ and it was the truest confirm I have ever given. Because I could see every layer of it exactly as she'd taught me, and I knew in my bones. She had the air read to the quarter-mill across 2 miles of moving morning. The general stepped into the loading bay at 6:52 by my watch. He was a shape in a long coat, and even at 2 miles, even as a pale smudge in the glass, you could read the command in how he stood, hands clasped behind him, feet planted, surveying the west bank and the river and the mill district, and all of us with the slow, proprietary sweep of a man reading a map he intends to finish. He had killed a great many of my friends with his careful mind, from behind this river, and he had never once imagined that the west bank could reach him here, because no one on the west bank could. No one but the corporal we'd handed the broken gun. Target, I breathed. Loading bay center standing, he's yours. I felt her go still in the way that is past stillness, the way where the pulse itself seems to wait. The widow's muzzle did not waver. 2 miles away the general lifted a hand to point at something on our bank, some seam in our line he'd found, some new death he was arranging, and in the glass I saw the mirage lean and steady, and I heard Voss exhale, half her breath and then the pause. And in the pause, in the held bottom of that breath, with the broken rifle that wanted to misdial dead honest by the only shooter who'd ever bothered to learn its heart, she pressed the shot. The widow fired, and the sound of it in that concrete room was enormous and then gone, and the round went out into the 2 miles of gray morning to keep its appointment. I have tried many times to describe the 6 seconds that followed, and I have never gotten it right, because they were the longest 6 seconds of my life, and they were over before I understood they'd begun. The round left the muzzle at more than half a mile a second and immediately began to lose that speed, and to fall, and to be pushed left in the near third by the wind off our own bank, straightened over the cold rising column above the river, leaned again in the far third by the wind curling off the eastern wall, and all of it, every layer, was already accounted for, already dialed, already spent before the trigger broke, because she had not fired a hopeful round into the wind. She had fired a round into a solved equation, and now the equation simply took its time arriving at the answer. Through the glass I watched the general's pale shape. I watched his pointing hand. I counted without meaning to, the way you count thunder after lightning, 1, and the round was over the rail yard, 2, and it was crossing the dead zone, 3, and it was out over the gray water where the cold air rose. 4. And it was climbing the far bank into the general's careful, unsuspecting world. 5. And at 6, the shape in the loading bay went down. Not dramatically. That is the thing the films never get right. He did not fly backward or throw up his arms. He simply stopped being a standing man and became a falling one, all at once, the way a marionette drops when the hand lets go of the strings, and he went down onto the concrete floor of the bay and did not get up. And around him the small figures of the security detail flew apart in sudden panic, scattering, dragging, staring wildly at a west bank that could not possibly have reached them and just had. For a moment I could not speak. 2 miles away, in a loading bay no rifle on our side of the river was ever supposed to touch, the man who had been killing us with his careful mind lay still, and the panic of his men spread out around him like ripples from a stone dropped into deep water. And beside me, a quiet corporal with a broken rifle lay perfectly composed behind the glass, watching the thing she had built come true. "Down," I managed. My voice did not sound like my own. "He's down. Confirmed down. He's not moving. They're pulling him. Voss, he's down." She did not cheer. She did not smile. She worked the bolt of the widow, smooth and unhurried, chambered a fresh round out of pure discipline in case a second was needed, and watched through her own scope until she was certain the first had been enough. Only then did she let out a long, slow breath, and I saw something go out of her shoulders, not triumph, but the particular release of a person setting down a weight they've carried so carefully that carrying it looked, to the untrained eye, like ease. "Confirmed," she said quietly. "Good spot, Staff Sergeant. Your read on the far third was dead on." Your read. As though I had done anything but sit beside a master and hand her the numbers she'd already known. She gave me the far third the way you tuck a coin into a beggar's cup, not because I'd earned it, but because she was the kind of person who'd rather share a shot she'd built alone than stand on top of it by herself. I had carried her a broken rifle to tell her she was nothing. She had handed me a piece of the impossible so I wouldn't feel like nothing beside her. We broke the hide down in a silence that had something close to reverence in it, and we went back through the ruins, and by the time we reached the mill the word had already run ahead of us up the line. Because the enemy's whole east bank had gone loud and confused and leaderless in the space of a single morning, and everyone with a radio knew that something had happened to the clockmaker, and everyone with eyes turned to the two of us coming in from the northern hide. The captain met us on the mill floor. He looked at Voss, and he looked at the widow slung across her back, the broken gun, the joke, the do not trust still taped to the stock in a dead man's handwriting, and he looked at me, and he asked the only question that mattered. "Is he dead?" "He's down and he didn't get up, sir," I said. 2 miles, first round, loading bay of the elevator. I watched it land. I paused, and then I said the truest thing I had said in years. "It wasn't me. I couldn't have made that shot. Nobody in this section could have made that shot. She built it over 4 mornings, and she made it off the rifle we gave her to insult her, and I was lucky to be allowed to hold the glass." The mill was very quiet. The men were all there now, all of them, the whole section, Rook among them, and they were looking at Voss the way you look at a thing you have badly misjudged. And the shape of what they'd done, what we'd done, the tape, the laughter, careful with the antique, sweetheart, was settling onto them one face at a time. And then the reveal came, the way these things always come, sideways and quiet and from an unexpected hand. A staff officer had come up the line with the confirmation traffic, a captain from the intelligence shop, wanting to know who had made the shot that had just decapitated the enemy's command of Kadresh, for the report that would go all the way up. He had Voss's name from the captain, and he was writing it down, and then he stopped writing, and he looked up at her, and his face changed. "Voss," he said slowly, "Dana Voss, corporal." He said it the way a man says a name he's read somewhere he didn't expect to meet it in the flesh. "You're not, you were on the Marden Plateau, 2 years ago, the relief of the northern posts." She said nothing, but she didn't say no either, and the not saying no was very loud. The intelligence captain turned to the rest of us, and there was something almost like awe in his voice, the awe of a man who deals in records and files, and has just watched one of them stand up and walk into the room. "There's a shot on the books from Martin," he said. "Longest confirmed kill our forces have ever recorded. It's classified in the particulars, but the distance isn't it's taught, it's in the marksmanship course. They use it as the outer edge of the possible. Every long-range shooter in this army knows that number, and none of them know the name attached to it, because the name was held back." He looked at Voss, at the broken rifle on her back, at the quiet corporal we'd handed the worst gun in the armory. "The call sign on that record is Stillwater." I heard Rook make a small sound, like a man who has just missed a step in the dark. "Because we all knew the number. Of course we did. It was the number they gave you in the schoolhouse as the ceiling, the shot at the far edge of physics that a human being had made once, under God knew what conditions, and that you were meant to understand you would never, ever equal. It had a call sign and no face. For 2 years it had been a legend with the name filed off. And the legend had come up to us on a resupply truck in the gray before dawn, and sat down against the wall with her hands folded on her ruck, and taken the broken rifle from my hands without a flinch, and said thank you, Staff Sergeant, and gone quietly to work in the corner while we laughed. Stillwater. I understood the call sign then, standing on that mill floor, not because she was cold, because she was the surface of deep water on a still day, nothing moving on top, and everything you'd ever need underneath, and a depth beneath the calm that men like me, standing on our little mountains, never think to measure until the day it saves our lives. Voss shifted the widow on her shoulder. The tape on the stock caught the light "Do Not Trust," and she looked down at it, and for the first and only time I saw something almost like a smile touch the corner of her mouth, and it was not aimed at any of us. It was aimed at the rifle. "It's a good gun," she said to no one, to the widow, to the men who'd called it a joke. "It never once lied to me about what it was." Then she looked up and swept the whole silent section with those level, patient eyes, and there was no triumph in her face, no gloat, no reckoning demanded. She had made her point 2 miles away with a single round, and she had no need to make it again in the mill. It just needed somebody to do the work, she said, instead of deciding it couldn't be done. And she meant the rifle. But she did not only mean the rifle, and every man on that floor knew it, and not one of them had a word to say. I was the section's best shot for 3 years. I had earned it, and I'd guarded it, and I'd carried a broken rifle across a mill floor to a woman I'd already decided was nothing, because I was afraid of what it would mean if she were something. That is the smallest I have ever been, and I was that small in front of the finest shooter I will ever meet, and she never once made me pay for it. She just did the work I wouldn't have done, off the gun I'd handed her to shame her, and then she gave me the far third of the shot so I could stand beside the impossible instead of under it. Rook stepped forward after a long moment. Rook, of all of them the worst mouth in the section, the loudest laugh that first morning. He didn't say he was sorry, because men like Rook don't have the words and she wouldn't have wanted them. He just came to attention, slow and deliberate in the middle of that ruined mill, and he brought his hand up in a salute, not the sloppy parade ground kind, but the real kind, the kind you give a thing you have finally understood is above you, and he held it. And then, one by one, without an order, without a word, the whole section came to attention around her, the men who'd laughed, and they saluted the corporal with the broken rifle, and she stood there in the gray light and let them, because it was theirs to give and it was owed, and she had never once needed it. I was the last, I think, to raise my hand, not because I was proudest, because I was the one who'd carried her the rifle, and I understood better than any of them exactly how far I'd had to travel to lift that arm, and I wanted to feel every inch of the distance. 2 miles she'd shot. It was the shorter of the 2 journeys made that morning. Mine was the longer one, the one from the doorway where I'd stood watching a woman waste ammunition on a broken rifle, all the way to that salute, and I have never in my life been more glad to have crossed a distance I'd sworn could not be crossed. The best shot in the section, they used to call me. I gave the title up gladly, the seventh morning in Kadresh, on a broken rifle 2 miles from a river, to a quiet woman named Stillwater who never once asked for it, and never needed it, and earned it 100 times over before any of us ever thought to look.